We will first be hearing opening statements coming from the plaintiff. Plaintiff, you have 2 minutes.
Okay. On March 5th, 2020, petitions were posted onto the UCI government and media page that called for the recall of 23 ASUCI senators. In less than 72 hours, every petition filed hit quorum. Article 12, Section 4 of the ASUCI Constitution states that the student body has the right to call for a recall and removal of ASUCI elected and appointed officers. Within 3 days after the petitions hit quorum, it is the duty of the Elections Commissioner to call for a special election. It is then the duty of the ASUCI Senate to approve the proposed timeline for said election. The legislation R5554, recall special election timeline, was not voted on and sent to Rules Committee. A second legislation was drafted, R5562, revised special election timeline. It still has not been voted on. Continuing to push back a special election not only violates Article 12, Section 4 of the Constitution, but it also violates Article 3, Section 1, Subsection H of the ASUCI Constitution, which states that students have the right to freedom of investigation and expression, and Article 3, Section 1, Subsection P, students have the right to transparency and freedom of information from their student government and leaders free of cost. I want to cite evidence from the 2008 case, removal of the social ecology senator. The board agreed that ASUCI senators have certain duties that must be executed properly. The board also agreed that failure to execute these duties is ground for removal from office. I want to cite more evidence from a statement made from the Office of the Student Advocate General, or SAG. The SAG found from a 4-week investigation that 2 members of the ASUCI Senate were found to be abusing power, engaging in cronyism, harassment, coercion, and voter manipulation. This disputes the claim that the defendant made that the Senate has been nothing but forthcoming with the student body. The ASUCI Constitution also states that the proponents or named officials may challenge the commission's decision or to the judicial board up to 72 hours from the election commission's validation. The defendant also stated that these petitions were not properly filed because the Elections Commission was not at quorum. If this is the case, no complaints were brought to the Judicial Board or Elections Commissioner at the time of the petitions being filed. Despite the status of the Elections Commission, the right to recall is still protected under the Constitution.
Mr. Plaintiff, you'll be able to make these arguments in full, but that's your full time for an opening statement.
Okay.
Thank you. We'll now be moving on to the opening statements of the defense. You have 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, members and Judicial Board. I'll be speaking on behalf of the defendants. Today we'll be discussing the authority of the Senate and the Constitution and the Constitution and bylaw actions taken by the Senate and the rule of law. Today we'll be providing a pivotal moment whether the rule of law is followed or upset activists that believe they are the arbiter of what is right and wrong, and the undated hostilities from the executive department and their staff, aggression stemming from the impeachment of President Randy. This goes into talk where we'll be discussing the Constitution, the authority of the Senate, and the actions taken by the Senate in the Rules Committee, which is stipulated by the ASUCI Constitution and bylaws. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, defendant. We will now be moving on to main arguments. The plaintiff will be allowed to present their argument at this time. Okay. You have 8 minutes.
Okay. Despite this, I'm going to pick off from where I left off. Despite the status of the Elections Commission not being at quorum, the right to recall officials is still granted and protected under the Constitution. Plus, there is precedent with the general election this year that the Elections Commissioner worked with the Judicial Board to carry out an election. So this situation should be treated no differently. I hope that the board comes to an agreement to ensure that students' rights are guaranteed. The ASUCI Constitution is the governmental document that's in question that grants the students the right to recall elected officials, not the Elections Code or the Elections Commission. The Elections Code is a code and procedures for conducting the student government election. Elections Commissioner and Commission carries out the election and ensures the code is followed. Failure to act upon a recall is a violation of the student rights guaranteed by the Constitution. Yeah. Also, the defendant stated in their rebuttal petition that the case Knight versus Elections Commissioner nullifies any sort of recall election That argument is flawed because the bone of contention in that case was the Elections Code and the Elections Commission, not the Constitution. Matters concerning the validity of the recall can only come from the Constitution, since the Constitution allows for the students to call for a recall and removal from officials. I'll yield my time.
Thank you, Plaintiff. At this time, we'll be hearing from the defense. You have 8 minutes. If one of the defendants are speaking, you may be muted at this time.
I believe so. Nick Ortiz was going to be stepping down for this portion, talking about the effect of the policies and judicial ruling on election commissioner.
Mr. Ortiz?
Yes, hi. So beginning with addressing the plaintiffs, addressing the recall and the special election. Yes, that is true that the plaintiff is correct that the recall had actually hit the quorum that they had needed. But when addressing that number, when especially addressing the Constitution, it is only actually 3% of the population. Now, that is quite concerning considering the fact that a lot of our referenda this past election has actually been reliant on more than 3% of the population in order to get and implement such policies going further. When looking at that, we do need to especially look at Knight versus Elections Commission, because the Judicial Board has ruled that the Elections Commissioner has ruled things such as the elections for the special election was nullified. This is extremely important because when as somebody who is on Rules Committee at the moment, when it comes to Senate, we have a problem because we have held on to both an initial recall and a revised recall, both being, I believe, R5554 and R5562. Both have been held onto by the Rules Commission specifically to address Knight versus Elections Commissioner, because we wanted to see exactly what would come of a nullified sentence from Judicial Board. This is extremely important because originally we did not pass this because we were skeptical from that said lawsuit. We wanted to make sure that things were going through, and as we had suspected, the Elections Commissioner had worked out on his own and consequently of that ruling alone, all of his business had been nullified. Moving on to the Constitution. The plaintiff does address that this is a constitutional matter more so than an elections and an elections commission problem. We do need to address this when talking about it. I believe we are going to talk about when talking about the Constitution. The ASUCI Constitution does actually specifically talk in Article 10, Section 2, Subsection L, that actually instead of the Senate just accepting one, the Senate is actually passed a this recall, and they have the ability to either approve or not approve. That isn't necessarily the problem. I think that the Judicial Board has proven that something has been nullified, and whether it be approved or not approved is decided by the Senate, not by any other thing. And this is proven by the Constitution. Thus, I yield my time.
And I'll pick up from there and finish. Mr. Gandol, how much time do you have left?
You have 2 minutes and 46 seconds.
I'd like to bring in this Constitution about Article 10 and Section 1. It says, the election commission is composed of 1 election commissioner and 4 deputy commissioners. And the election commission has the authority of the ACO election, related activities, and under the authority has this power that's granted by the Senate. So the fact that there is no commission the commission was null and void, and the commissioner does not have authority in himself to approve any special elections, then there is no special elections. And considering on subsection 2, let me pull it up for you. Subsection 2I, to call set date for special elections is subject to approval by the Senate. Subsection M, to create the rules, policies, process under the authority of elections code, subject to approval by the Senate. So, as we have discussed already, in Rules Commission and by policy, it is the subject of the Senate to approve special elections, and this is a check and balance on hijacking of elections by a minority group, forcing opinions that they didn't agree with to push out an entire Senate. This is kind of the check and balance on direct democracy. And also when we talk about also the quorum that was brought up on the vote, there were never any published verification by the election commissioner that the votes were verified, that they were correct, and they were legitimate. As we've seen with other referendums, that there have been hundreds of votes that did not count after they were passed. There was an argument or previously said that all votes are valid. We know that is not correct. So since there has never been any type of verification and being ratified that the votes are correct in total, then there is a question about the legality of the votes themselves, on top of the right of the Senate to approve special elections, and that the election commissioner does not have the authority to call special elections on his own by the previous legislation, Justice versus Knight. Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. We're going to now move. Hold on, let me timer. We're going to move on to rebuttals. The plaintiff will first be allowed to provide a rebuttal. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, so I just want to add something. The prayer of relief that I and a lot of other students are seeking is that the Elections Commission, the Elections Commissioner and the Judicial Board collaborate on making sure that this recall election goes through to ensure that students' rights are protected. That's the prayer of relief that I'm searching for. So I forgot to mention that. Alan, do you want to take over for now?
Yes, I'll be doing the rebuttal, Chief Justice. So Article 12, Section 4 of the ASUCI Constitution states that these recall petitions go to the Elections Commissioner, not the Elections Commission. The Elections Commission nullified both versions of the Elections Code that were in contention at the time, and the Elections Commissioner is allowed to make these petitions public. They all hit quorum within the time stated in the Constitution, and though the Elections Commission allows the Commissioner, and through the Elections Commission, the ruling allows the Elections Commissioner in conjunction with the Judicial Board to adjudicate the election, which was done for the general spring elections. And going back to Article 12, Section 4 of the Constitution, it states, a recall is started by the undergraduate student delivering a petition which names the official and alleges the reason for recall to the Elections Commissioner. The petition must then be signed within 5 weeks of instruction by undergraduate students, totaling at least 10% of the votes cast in the last regular election for that office. In the case of executive officers, at-large, and special interest senators, the student advocate general. 25% of the votes cast in the last regular election for that office in the case of school-based senators, or 1% of the undergraduate students in the case of members of the Judicial Board. Within 3 days of receiving the signatures, the Elections Commission must validate them and call a special election if the requirements are met. Because all of these petitions hit quorum, and the Senate is saying that there is no Elections Commission because they don't have quorum, using the ruling in Knight v. Elections Commission, the Senate can still move to have the special election, having the Elections Commissioner and the Judicial Board work in tandem. But they haven't made any efforts to do that. Furthermore, the argument that the defense feels that the quorum for the petition is too low is not a question of law. For them, that's an argument of how they feel, that they feel that they were wronged somehow, or that this is not in their favor. So I don't think that they're bringing an actual question of law. And if they want to, they can question the constitutionality of the recall clauses in the Constitution. I yield the rest of my time to the plaintiff.
I also wanted to say that once the petitions do hit quorum, they close. So that's how the petitions work. So they hit each of these petitions hit like way above within the time frame of the quorum. So if you wanted more students to vote, that's too bad because the petitions are going to close. So once they hit quorum, they're closed and they're done for. I yield my time.
All right. Does the plaintiff rest their case for the rebuttals?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. We're going to be moving on to defense rebuttal. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chemo. Hello, everyone. My name is Bryce Lindsay, and I want to point out that Article 12 under Direct Democracy, Section 4E says, within 3 days from receiving the signatures, the Elections Commission must validate them and call a special election if the requirements are met. It says Elections Commission, not Elections Commissioner. If we look at Knight versus Elections Commissioner, Ronner is in the opinion, and it says in the absence of a quorum, any business transaction is null and void. And further, they say in their opinion that therefore we deem the actions undertaken by the Election Commission as null and void. Regardless, if this was properly called, the Senate still reserves the right to approve of a special election. If the Judicial Board were to work with the Elections Commission to fulfill this void with not hitting quorum, all the Judicial Board could do according to the Constitution is call a special election. But the Senate would still have the authority to approve or not approve the special election. And that leads us to the reason of why did the founders of the Constitution allow Senate the subject to approval? And it's simple, it's to act as a check and balance on the executive branch. Because 97% of a senator's constituents may like what they do, but if 3% don't, then they recall them. And that is clearly undemocratic. And that's why the Senate has this authority. I yield my time to the other defendants.
I would like to reiterate that also in subsection 2 as a rebuttal, on the very heading of section Article 10, Section 1, it says the Election Commission is composed of 1 elections commissioner and 4 deputy commissioners. It does not say that the commissioner has the sole authority. And it said the authority and powers of the Election Commission has only authority of the AAC election-related activities. And it's also, as I said, subject to approval of, as Mrs. Senator Lindsay said, approval of the Senate as a check and balance. So when the plaintiff stated that the election commissioner has the sole authority to call a special election, he does not. The commission does. Absent the commission, there is no special elections. And we never said that there was never enough votes. We said we questioned the quantity of the votes and being validated and ratified. There's never been a report submitted saying that the votes were ratified and validated. We have not seen it. It was not presented. And so how can we say that these votes are valid? So it goes back to more towards democracy in the Constitution. Their report needed to be submitted and needed to be validated and ratified. The Election Commission as a total needed to approve a timeline, and it's subject to approval of the Senate. It is in our Constitution. And it acts, as Senator Lindsay said, it acts as a check and balance to activists who think they can hijack our democracy. Thank you, sir, for your time.
Chief Justice Gandil, how much time do we have?
You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
So just one quick rebuttal on the issue of transparency. I do want to actually point out against the plaintiff's point of the lack of transparency. Not only has Senate overall remained transparent through actually continuing their live streams on Facebook, but also the Rules Committee itself has maintained an abundance of notes every time that we meet and make quorum. At no point has anybody in the Senate or anybody from Senate prevented the Facebook live stream. The only time that has ever been stopped is when there has been an issue with connection, or the people like Aaron Eccles has not been able to make the connection clear. But even then, we record we record our meetings and then we post it on Facebook. So at no point do I see an ability that Senate has been untransparent, and I really wanted to address that because that is incredibly important when Senate is being accused of being untransparent. The only time other than that has also been through executive sessions, which is allowed to Senate when it comes to Robert's Rules of Order, and we are protected by that. And so that's my call to that argument, and I yield the rest of our time.
Thank you. Give me a moment. At this time, we're going to be moving into closing statements. We will first hear from the plaintiff.
Okay. The defendant's argument that he made has been very flimsy and is based on speculation and how they feel because they are recalled senators. I want to first touch upon that the defendant stated that if 3% of the student population had a problem with how the ASUCI conducted it, then what about the 97 who would vote in the recall election and then stop the recall from happening? Second of all, I wanted to touch on transparency. Again, I'm going to go back to this Office of the Student Advocate General report that found that 2 members of the Senate have been engaging in, abuse of power, cronyism, harassment, coercion, and voter manipulation. In what way is that considered transparent? That is not transparent. If the Student Advocate General has to step in and make a statement, that's not transparent because that means that something's going on. That's actually corruption, if you ask me. Going forward, I wanted to reiterate my plea of relief that the Elections Commissioner and the Judicial Board work together to validate this special election in order to preserve the rights and liberties that are protected by the ASUCI Constitution. Thank you. I yield my time.
All right, thank you, plaintiff. We'll now be moving on to the defendant's closing statement. You have 2 minutes.
Sir, I'd like to start off with saying that the Constitution serves to prevent the attempts of mob rule and that we are a government of rules and laws. And also, we take offense to Mr. Janani, who keeps on saying that recalled. We are not recalled senators. A petition does not make a recalled senator. A recalled senator is only after an election is held and all the votes are counted and tallied and verified as someone recalled. And 2, the fact that there is a conflict of interest between the Student Advocate General and his staff regarding his connection with the president and an impeachment. We already established that during the previous trial that there were issues with that. Also, on top of that, the Student Advocate General and his staff are not prosecutors and they cannot find anyone guilty. We also had open questioning during Senate where we asked them about some of these so-called investigations. We found multiple inconsistencies and false information provided regarding some of the statements they made. So, and this has nothing to do with what we're here for. We're here whether the authority of the Senate to call for the approval or not of a special election. We're here to prove whether the commission itself has the authority to call the special election. We have proved already that the commission is null and void because there's no commission set forth by Knight. That the commissioner himself does not have the authority to call special elections. That the commission did not submit a report for verifying the votes. That the Constitution gives the sole authority to approve or disapprove the special elections by the Senate. And even if he's asking for relief by the Judicial Board and the Special Commission to work together, it's still subject to the approval of the Senate. So there's no question whether there's law or not. There is. The Constitution sets it forth. And to say also that, so to say that the people in the student body aren't engaged in anything except general election, even then, we get less than 50%.
Defendant, unfortunately, that your time has expired. Thank you, though. We will now be moving on to the last part of the hearing pursuant to the ASUCI Judicial Board hearing protocol, questions on behalf of the Judicial Board. We're going to start with my other associate justices. I'm just going to go down the line and give them a period to question you. The time is not specific here in the document, so we're going to refer to Robert's Rules of Order. So all associate justices will have 10 minutes. We're going to start with Jeremy Bunda. Justice Bunda?
I asked if you could come back to me at a later time while I still organize my notes, if that is okay.
Yes, that's fine, Justice Bunda. We're going to move on to then Justice Naktvi. Am I pronouncing your name? I always mispronounce your name, Ms. Colson.
It's okay. I think my first question to both the prosecution and the defense, you guys can take turns answering this, is I don't know if you guys, someone on each side has a copy of the Constitution pulled up, but I just want your take on Article 8, Section 2, Subsection K of the Constitution.
Kimo, any way you can share it so we can all...
Yes, I will. Give me a moment. Could you repeat that citation, Justice Colson? Justice?
Article 8, Subsection 2, Section 2, Subsection K.
Article 8, Section 2?
Yeah.
7, 8.
I can respond if you wish. It's pretty clear. It says to issue a temporary injunction on all Senate legislation until an elections commissioner is appointed. It shows that it's if there's no elections commissioner. There currently is an elections commissioner. There are no deputy elections commissioners. So this will not apply to the situation at hand.
The plaintiff can respond.
Do you have anything to say?
Yeah, same.
I have a follow-up to the plaintiff, to the prosecution then, the defense, if...
I'm sorry, Justice, is there a prosecutor here? I'm not, are we on trial?
Plaintiff.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, okay.
Continue, Justice Naktvi.
Can you just clarify the purpose of this article of this segment piece of the Constitution?
Are you asking me?
And even on your side.
Okay. Yeah, I think the purpose is if there's no elections commissioner to conduct a election, then the Senate would have to appoint one. But it's pretty clear. It doesn't say deputy elections commissioner. It only says elections commissioner.
I believe so. The idea is that the commission as a total body requires a commissioner and 4 deputies. So you have to have the entire commission as a whole complete.
Okay. Yeah, as far as the issues of transparency go, I know that I think it was Senator Ortiz on your side who said that Rules Committee takes notes. Are they posted anywhere like the ASUCI website?
Yeah, they should be. If not, we can have them sent to you.
It's not about me. It's about transparency to the public in general.
No, of course, yeah, we always post it, and we are more than willing to I'm pretty sure it's Justice. No, sorry. It is Senator Wolf who takes the notes, and Senator Clark, who is always in charge of those. We do have those posted, and we are able to share with anybody. And I'm pretty sure we do post that on the website.
Okay, and I know you mentioned in your petition, in your response to the petition, that members of the public come to Senate meetings and they can basically witness what's going on. So when committees break out, do members of the public also get assigned to the committees they want to check up on?
Yeah. Wait, do you mean like they're assigned to their committees? Because they are, that's always established in the beginning of the quarter.
No, I'm not talking about senators. I'm saying if a member of the public comes to a Senate meeting and they want to say keep up with what's going on in rules. So when rules committee breaks, do they go to rules?
They can if they would like.
Is this option presented to them?
I don't know exactly. I think that if anything, if a member of the public would like to, I'm pretty sure Senator Clark would be more than happy to share that with people. But at the moment, no one has asked us, and presently there have only been there's been a very limited number of people attending public comment or joining in on the Zoom meeting as is.
Okay. I don't want to take up all of J-Board's question time, but I will ask where exactly on the website do you guys post the minutes from each committee?
It's underneath minutes.
I'm not talking about like Senate's minutes in general. I'm talking about notes from the committees individually.
If you go to agenda, there's something called the agenda and then the minutes. And you break down the minutes by the date. It breaks down the different committees and what happened in each committee.
But it's not an in-depth analysis because like from the agenda itself, from the minutes and the agenda, it just has the legislations on your agenda. It doesn't necessarily but it doesn't necessarily break down what's being discussed.
For example, if you look on April 28th, if you go to, say, Finance Committee agenda or Rules Committee, you'll see under Wolf-Lindsay 22 Esports Investment Act, they'll say what they did. They referred back, they will give their recommendations of what they discussed, referred back to the floor, recommended amendment on Section 7, explanation of the definition of refreshment, move to adopt the Finance Committee recommendation, motion back to clerk, objection. It breaks it all down right there. If you want a detailed note of, I think the detailed conversation, I don't think no one holds a detailed conversation. It just minutes, notes about what was discussed and what was the recommendations.
Okay, well,
that's traditional note-taking in minutes for any legislative body. It's not an in-depth word-for-word meeting where everything's copied down.
Himo, come back to me if you still have time at the end, but I don't want to take up all of J-Board time.
J-Board's time's already defined, so let me just mark it down. You have 2 minutes and 50 seconds left, Colson. Okay, we're going to move on to the next. Miss Madison Craw. Justice Craw, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have one. So if the special elections are subject to approval by the Senate per the Constitution, wouldn't that allow the Senate to make the decision to approve the election or not? And that goes to both parties.
We'll hear from the plaintiff first, then the defense.
That's pretty much why I filed this petition, because that's I believed was happening, that the special election was being held off because the majority of the Senate was being brought into question for recall. So that's personally what I believe, but other people might have other opinions. I yield my time.
All right, we'll hear from the defense.
Associate Justice Craw, could you please ask your question again? I'm so sorry.
So My question is, if the special elections are subject to approval by the Senate per the Constitution, wouldn't that allow the Senate to make the decision to approve the election or not?
Is your question, do we have to confirm it? Or are you saying, I think she's asking, do we have the choice, correct?
Correct.
I think
go ahead, sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Lindsay.
no, you go, Mr. El Sharif.
I think it's not that we approve the election, it's whether it goes to election. So the approval, whether the timeline, and we ratify that we approve the special election to take place. Another, whether the actual election happen and whether it's passed or not, we don't have the authority with, oh no, yeah, we're gonna not approve this election. It's whether it goes to a special election. And that is the authority granted in the Constitution to the Senate to work as a check and balance for this exact reason. The plaintiff is attempting to supersede and go around the Constitution because he doesn't agree with the rule of law and the Constitution, as they are the arbiter of what is right and wrong. In essence, he's trying to avoid the Constitution and the authority of the Senate.
Okay, thank you.
All right, before we move on to my questions, Justice Bunda, are you ready?
Yes, I have a question. So, does the defense think that there can be an invalid reason where the Senate would refuse to approve a special election? Or are all instances of the Senate's refusal to approve a recall election, is it automatically going to be acceptable? Or are there instances where if the Senate refuses to approve the election, that their reasoning can be invalid?
I believe that the Senate has we have the authority to approve, subject to approval, which means that the Senate can disapprove of a special election. And the reasoning behind that is because it serves as a check and balance in case that a minority wishes to repeal a duly elected Senate, it would prevent such power, because if it only requires less than 3% of the student body to recall a group and 15% vote in a normal general election, then it wouldn't even make sense to have general elections, because if your candidates would lose, then you could just recall the winners, which we have seen an attempt by the ASUCI executives to do so, and thereby the Senate reserves the right to approve or disapprove. If that wasn't the case, it wouldn't be in the Constitution, but it is.
Okay, I was just asking if that power by which the Senate can approve or disapprove a special election, I was just asking if that power is unfettered or not. If the Senate can provide any reasoning by which they would disapprove a special election and it would stand. Because what I'm seeing is that in this case, a special election would go toward the purpose of removing senators. So I was just wondering if the Senate can have that unfettered power of preventing any of themselves from being removed from office.
Can I say something?
Yeah, the Constitution clearly states that they have the authority to...
Senator, let's first hear from the plaintiff.
Okay, first off, Senator El Sharif, I just want to remind you, please use my proper pronouns. I already said this once in the chat. Thanks. Justice Wanda,
I don't use those pronouns.
Order. Let's have order here, ladies and gentlemen. Plaintiff, you may continue.
Justice Wanda, may I offer a statement on your question? I think that the intention of adding that section that requires the Senate to approve was intended to add inter-branch coordination, there's no legitimate grounds for which the majority of the Senate can legitimately overthrow the will of a recall. Also, if the student body did want to remove members of the Senate, they hold that right because it says so in the Constitution. The students have the right to direct democracy. So, yeah, I yield my time.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to go back and just press the defense on my question because I'm not satisfied with the line of reasoning I have received. So let me propose a scenario. So let's say that there was a functioning elections commission right now who can meet quorum, and they set the dates for the special election, which is subject to approval by the Senate. Is there a possibility in which the Senate would act unconstitutionally in disapproving the special election?
I'll be happy to answer you. Says no. If the votes were ratified, or if the Constitution was followed, and there were a duly elected commissioner and commission, where a special election is going to be called based on the fact that all votes were verified and rectified. That means there legitimate votes have been placed. There were no inconsistencies. The report was submitted 3 days after the special referendum was placed. If all of the steps were taken, then no, there would be no reason why the Senate would not approve it. I mean, yes, it's in total body and it would require the unanimous decision of the Senate to pass it all, but that's how it would work. But the question here is that we do not have a election commission that was null and void. We do not have the report. We've never had a verification of the votes. So we were never ratified. So when you look at the totality of it, no, there is a legitimate reason why the Senate can not approve the special election, because there isn't a special election to ratify, because there's no commission. On top of that, we also have to take the will of the entire student body. To say that 3% or 2%, whatever minority group, can hijack the entire Senate and have them removed is undemocratic. But if all the Constitution and every subsection and bylaws were followed correctly, no, there wouldn't be no reason why the Senate would not approve the special elections. If there, as I said, the votes were verified, ratified, reports were published, and a duly installed commissioner and commission, which is the election commission needs to require a commissioner and 4 deputy commissioners put together. And then if all that information is provided, then it would go to the Senate for approval. There wouldn't be no reason not to approve it, but it still needed a vote amongst the commission, the Senate, sorry.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify what you were saying. So I believe that you said that if there are like the sufficient procedures by which the special elections would go to the Senate, which includes, a functioning elections commission that can meet quorum, you are saying that there would be no reason that the Senate would not approve the special election.
Not that there would not be no reason. It would still require a vote of the Senate, of course, right? And this will be debated upon. But just to say we're not going to vote on it just because, no, there wouldn't be a legitimate reason to do so. But as long as the votes were verified, it was ratified, the report was published, right, which was required by the Constitution, and then there was a quorum and the special election voted on it and set time and date, then it would go to the Senate, and at that point we would do our legislative duties, discussing it and put it to a vote. It first go to Rules Committee and then put it to a vote and follow all the pieces of policies and procedures. Now, can I say that every single senator is going to vote for it? I can't say that. That's not how we work. We're not a dictatorship. We can't say, well, nope, it passed, you have to vote for it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, just pressing you on that point, on that line of thought that you're going to. So let's say that it does come to a point where the Senate is voting upon the timeline of the recall election. What my question is there is there a possibility that the Senate would act unconstitutionally in voting no to the timeline, or are we just supposed to take their votes as unquestionable? So if they vote no to removing their senators from themselves from office, is that not supposed to be questioned? Or is there a reason where the Senate would not act constitutionally in voting yes to the special election?
I can speak on this.
Thank you.
Nowhere does it say, I don't understand your argument that the Senate would be acting unconstitutionally if they were to decide to vote no, if a majority voted no, because, you know, the Senate is a governing body, the deliberative body that has, you know, the ability to vote yes, vote no. I don't understand, nowhere in the Constitution does it say all senators must vote yes. It says subject to approval. So if a majority voted no, it would not be approved. That's not acting unconstitutionally.
I was just asking if there is any sort of like reasoning whatsoever where the Senate voting no would be would not be constitutional. I totally understand that the Senate can vote however it wants. I was just asking if there is like any sort of instance or reasoning or any way at all where if the Senate votes no, then nobody can question it, and another body can intervene.
Mr. Bunda, I apologize, but your time is up. If another judge wishes to yield and no other judge objects, I will permit that, even though yielding is not usually allowed in RONR.
Can we answer the question?
We unfortunately are out of time. Justice Colson, you have some time left if you wish to yield it to Justice Bunda, or do you wish to use your time? All right.
I actually have a question going off of what Justice Bunda's been asking, but so I want to ask that, and after that, if I have any time remaining, I want to yield that to him.
Okay. Since I apologize, Justice Bunda, but your time is up. We're going to be going on to Justice Nakvi. You have the floor for 2 minutes and 50 seconds of your remaining time.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Senator El-Sharif just said that if everything like from the elections commissioners and then the recall were valid, Senate would vote on this.
We would, if everything is lined up, if everything is followed procedure and policy and everything was constitutional and it was brought to the Senate floor, then after it had gone through Rules Commission, Rules Committee and everything, make sure that everything is correct, then we would take a vote. But it does not guarantee a passage. The Constitution says subject to.
Okay, I get that. So I just want to point out that I just want to ask that even before the Judicial Board ruled that the Elections Commissioner did not constitute quorum, there was already legislation for a recall and Senate did not act on it. So do you guys have anything to say about that?
I can. Well, that is correct. That we did, being in Rules Committee, we were very suspicious about the original issue with how the Elections Commissioner had dealt with the signatures and such. And as you guys have ruled, we did see, we decided to wait on it to see what was going on with Knight versus Elections Commissioner. And we did actually see that our suspicions were confirmed when you guys did rule the way that you did in Knight versus Elections Commission. That is why Rules Committee held on to it at that time.
Okay, I yield the rest of my time to Justice Bunda so he can ask his question.
Thank you, Justice. Do any of the justices object to that? Nope. Okay. Justice Bunda, you have a minute, and you have about a minute.
Okay, so just to repeat my question, I totally understand that the Senate can vote however it wants to. There is nothing in the Constitution saying that they have to vote in any other way. I was just asking if there is any specific way, instance, or reasoning that by voting no to legislation that sets dates to remove themselves from office, is there any way that that can be questioned by students as unconstitutional or otherwise?
If I'm understanding your question is whether you're saying that if the entire, I think what we're running into is that they're trying to recall the entire Senate, which is kind of never been heard of before. And this is why there's a check and balance. But if there was a discussion and say 3/4 of the Senate decided not to approve the special elections, whatever, based on the discussion, this is a hypothetical. I cannot say what will be the reasoning for each person. That if the student body eventually said, look, we're not happy with this, that, you guys chose not to do the special election, whatever the case may be,
Please
then
finish.
they could.
We're out of time. I apologize, but we're unfortunately out of time. Could you please finish?
Sure. Then a traditional election would happen, and they would replace the representatives. We disagree with a lot of things other senators, other representatives do, and that's why we have elections for. And so on the next scheduled election, which we just had, they would vote in their new senators that they want to represent them, or new executive branch that they want, because there's even executive branch that does things that they don't agree with, but it does not found unconstitutional, and that's why we have free and open elections to change your representatives if we're not happy with the representation or the job they're doing.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Justice Bunda. Before I provide my questions, Ms. Craw, do you have any final questions? Okay.
No, I do not have any more.
Perfect. Thank you, Justice Craw. Okay, so we'll go on to my question. My first question is pointed towards both in the audience. So R1R provides us pretty clear principles of interpretation. On page 589 at the bottom, it says, if the bylaws authorize, and by the way, bylaws and constitution are kind of interchangeable in R1R. If the bylaws authorize certain things specifically, other things of the same class are thereby prohibited. There's a presumption that nothing has been placed in the bylaws without some reason for it. There could be no valid reason for authorizing things to be done that can clearly be done without authorization in the bylaws unless the intent is to specify the things of the same class that may be done, all other things prohibited. Clearly, it seems that the class of behavior for approving a special election is that it has to be subject to approval by the Senate. My question to both the plaintiff and the defense is, if it's clear that there is a process in the Constitution that requires Senate approval, why doesn't Senate have deference to deciding if it's appropriate to call the special election?
I go first, or?
Yes, plaintiff.
Okay. So I think that they kind of contradict each other, because at one point it says that students have the right to freedom and investigation and expression, and that students have the right to transparency and freedom of information from their government and student leaders. Then they're saying that like the student government can step in and stop the process of students organizing to change the student government. So it kind of contradicts each other. So I think at the end of the day, personally, like I feel like since the students were the ones who elected or allowed for these representatives to be appointed, then they have the right to take them back. That's personally what I think. I yield my time.
I will respond for the defense. I believe that the reason it is there is for the Senate to act as a check and balance on the executive. And the reasoning being, under the current Constitution, it only required 156 signatures to meet the threshold for a recall election of an at-large senator. And there are only 30 senators in ASUCI, and there's at least around between 200 to 300 executive staffers. So therefore, under the current setup of the ASUCI Constitution, the executives could, in essence, remove senators they do not wish to have and replace them, thereby entering mob rule. So this is why it's in the Constitution. The real purpose of recall is to remove an abusive minority, whether it be one or two senators, not to completely recall the whole Senate because they have differing opinions than others within the student government.
All right, thank you. So my next question, I guess, is harps kind of on the underlying theory of the plaintiffs. What is exactly being done that's untransparent here? I know people are upset with the action of the Senate, but it's not like they don't know about the action, given this lawsuit clearly has all the elements of knowing about the action. Transparency would be like if they're hiding a document. So what is untransparent? And it seems like we're having to cross kind of a interpretation bridge here. My conjoining question to that for the plaintiff would be, what bounds do we know to this jurisdiction? Because if we're able to claim this piece of legislation generically doesn't fit transparency purposes, what could I say about, well, this piece of legislation damages my right to association, or this piece of legislation damages this generic category? Where do we stop on that? Because at some point, the judicial board becomes legislatures. Especially, your relief is not having us negate a government action. That's what we usually do. It's actually having us implement a government action. So my second question to the plaintiff is, at what point must we bound ourselves so the judicial board doesn't just replace the Senate?
Okay, to address your first part, first I want to mention that the special election petitions were hit quorum around the time, I don't have the exact date, I think it was like August 5th, August 6th, around that time. And the ruling for Knight versus Elections Commissioner was April 17th. A week after that, a week after the petitions hit quorum, a legislation was drafted to approve the special election timeline. So it's untransparent because it was sitting in Rules Committee for pretty much a month, sitting there, and they're stating that this Knight versus Elections Commissioner was the reason why. But that was in April. So what happened to that whole time? What happened to like the 3 or 4 Senate meetings? Second of all, to delay the handling of the Senate recall has been on the grounds of defending your jobs. It is untransparent to not address the legislation, only to say today that it is done because of Knight versus Election Commissioner. The Judicial Board has opened the door to granting greater power in its actions to handle the duties of the Elections Commission. So we're asking them to step in during this time. Not all the time, just during this time to step in because it's a special circumstance that we do not have a full Elections Commission. I yield my time.
All right, does the defense want to say anything about that quickly?
So let me ask you a question. So we had concurrence of adherence to the governing documents, and this was proven by the judicial ruling in Knight versus Election Commission. But let's take point by point. The transparency. There is always legislation that the Senate takes a look at. We had a question from the original. We've been having ongoing issues with the Election Commission and the Election Commissioner that not being a quorum, especially since we appointed our own commission per ASU bylaws and Constitution that were not accepted or didn't want to be ratified by the executive branch. They fought it. So let's take a look. A special election was, a referendum was placed. We never received a report. There should have been a report saying, these are how many votes were done. These are the votes that were ratified. These are the votes were validated. We never had this. In fact, you could go on the AAC website. There's no such report. That is one of the responsibilities of the election commissioner. No report was submitted. So that was one of some of the issues that was brought up in Rules Commission, that the reports were made. A, that there wasn't a quorum. B, that there wasn't a valid election commission. We had to wait until the judicial board voted on Knight versus Elections Commissioner to see whether we had standings or we had to go along with the way the rules were set up. As I said, we really had appointed other commission for the commissioners, but there were ongoing issues at which we had to wait for Knight versus Elections Commission to look at. So there wasn't any transparency. It's not like we didn't take a look at it. It's not like we discussed it. We did. We passed it along to the Rules Committee. Now, to say that we're not transparent because we didn't touch the legislation, that we're not doing our job, that was not true. We did touch the legislation. We did discuss it. We did move it to the Rules Committee. They discussed it. They had issues with it. Hello, are we still on?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
So what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry, Justice Gandil, because I know I was responding.
Well, I'm almost out of time, so let's just move on to the next question.
Sure.
So this goes to both parties again. The Constitution, Article 10, pretty much lays clear that the power to call elections is given by the Elections Commission, not Elections Commissioner. Maybe you can even start the petition, but you certainly can't call the election without the Elections Commission. So how did the Elections Commission approve calling a special election without any deputy election commissioners? They wouldn't have a quorum then per the Knight ruling. Let's hear from the plaintiff first and then the defense.
Can the defense go first?
Sure.
Sure. Quite simply, they are unable to without a quorum. So there's no way that they can call a special election without a quorum. That's not my opinion. That's in the Constitution.
Okay. Plaintiff?
Okay, so with the situation, I guess if there's issues with the timeline that requires a whole commission, then the judicial board should step in and work with the commissioner or the remaining parts of the commission. That doesn't invalidate the recall itself. The recall the students are still organizing, so there's still a recall that's being processed. So then it goes on the hands of the judicial board. That has to follow a procedure that is stipulated in the Constitution. So if it's a special circumstance, the judicial board works with the elections commissioner and then comes to an agreement to approve this special election and bring it to a referenda.
I would like to point out that the Internal Governance and Policy Committee is a committee that nominates deputy elections commissioners. So the Senate is not withholding the commission from meeting a proper quorum. It's the Internal Governance and Policy. So it is not the Senate's fault that a special election cannot be called right now.
And also, Justice Gandalf, the question is not the timeline. It's the question is the whole process. It's not the issue whether the timeline was good enough. It's whether that all the procedures were followed. A, that there was verification of the votes. B, it was ratified. C, that there was a report issued. None of these have happened. And if none of it has been reported or submitted. So it's not just the timeline. It is the entire process from A to Z, including that there's no, the commission does not have authority to call the special election on his own, and there wasn't even a commission. And as Senator Lindsay said, that it's the internal governance duty to appoint the commission and not the Senate.
All right, thank you. I have no further questions at this time, and my time is up. So that exhausts the rest of our trial. I want to make a couple things clear. The Judicial Board has marked our intention to deliberate on this formally on Sunday, and we will provide a full opinion Wednesday, or if we believe there is a sufficient question of fact, we will notify you Sunday and schedule a formal trial for next week. I hope, I'm currently of the opinion, and it looks like, based on my notes, the majority of this seems to be a question of law, but the Judicial Board as a whole body will be the one to decide that Sunday. Secondly, I will be sending this to Aaron, and I will have him post this recording on the Judicial Board page. I don't know how long that will take him, but I will send that today over to him. So you should be able to see that, I would hope, by this evening, but most likely by tomorrow evening, in case you want to rewatch any part of this hearing. Do I have any questions from the defense or the plaintiff at this moment?
No, sir.
Okay. Thank you both parties for participating. Parties are excused. We will reconvene on Wednesday to provide the verdict.
Thank you, sir.